A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. This evening we start with a thankful note. We acknowledge Sir David Seal and the folks of the People's Market, and we thank them for their continued interest and support in the production of this series, My Community. Now, we all undoubtedly recall our experiences with the coronavirus and how it affected our daily lives. Quite similarly, the cholera epidemic of 1854 had a negative impact on our people, which was evident in their responses to the crisis. In this, the final episode, we begin by discussing that impact and, interestingly enough, the role that religion played in this situation.
Cholera had a big impact on the society. Not only did it kill people and kill them quickly, but for those individuals who were alive, it had a devastating impact on them.
If you look at the record and you go through the British areas, you will see persons were screaming and they were saying, God is coming for his country. They thought that it was the end times.
Requiring, of course, counseling, and lots of priests and pastors were kept very busy counseling those persons who had lost loved ones.
The people of Barbados started to see the suffering and dying and the spread of this disease and all that they were going through as an act of God. So people started to seek God earnestly.
But for those who had lost loved ones, they also decided, especially those who were living in common law relationships, they also decided that they would get married.
There was a big religious revival in Barbados during the cholera epidemic. And Butcher again talks about this. He says one of the ironic things was that every Sunday during the epidemic there'd be a long list of bands, people announcing their weddings.
Those persons were not only encouraged to formalize their unions in marriage, but those persons who would have been thought or believed or said to be living in sin, those persons became man and wife.
And so the epidemic prompted thousands of couples to get married so that they could die as married couples.
So that the records will show that hundreds of people got married during the cholera epidemic, ensuring that, of course, if they had to die, they would die as married people, but of course they would not die in their sins. And then you have the increase in baptisms as well. Many persons who had come out of slavery had not been baptized. But during the cholera epidemic, people came forward as big men and women asking to be baptized because there was a view that, of course, Christian baptism was important. Both to have your name recognized and, of course, to be baptized as a Christian, as a person who accepted Jesus Christ as Savior.
Proclamation was made to establish a day of national humiliation and prayer. June the 14th was designated as that day, and it was also referred to as the fast day.
Sort of peak of the epidemic in Bridgetown, they had a special day of fasting and prayer on that day, praying to God to deliver them from the Holocaust.
It was a kind of atonement because the populace came to regard the epidemic as a visitation from God to punish them for their misdeeds. The churches and chapels were crowded as people gathered to seek God and his forgiveness, hoping that he would be gracious to them and the disease would be abated. The swiftness and the magnitude of death induced the populace to turn to a force greater than themselves. So they were looking for a way out, and they thought that God would be that way because they saw his hand or believed rather, that his hand was on the virus and causing it to happen.
And that meant that churches were crowded. So that on a daily basis, we have individuals flocking to the church to pray, individuals to meditate, and of course to hear a sermon. And on that day, when there was that national day of prayer and humiliation, hundreds of people came out to worship. But of course, unfortunately, that was the day when over 200 people were interred at Land's Ends.
And, you know, Butcher says that it was from that day that the disease began to recede. So, you know, God did deliver them ultimately.
So, of course, the cholera did not abate because of the day of prayer. It continued to wreak havoc among the population.
Now, gradually, the cholera outbreak burnt itself out, and it kind of petered out in October. After the epidemic was declared over, on the 2nd of November of 1854, they had a day of thanksgiving, essentially, thanking God, you know, for seeing them through the horrors and so on of it, you know, and it was, you know, an event that affirmed a lot of people's faith in God, or renewed and strengthened people's faith in God, I guess because they came through it.
And there were many who did not survive the cholera epidemic of 1854. Here are the official statistics. St. Michael and Bridgetown, 9,217. Christchurch, 2,360. St. Philip, 1,495. St. George, 1,313. St. John, 1,216. St. Lucy, 1,193. St. Andrew, 877. St. Peter, 854. St. Thomas, 801. St. James, 765. St. Joseph, 726. A total of 20,727 deaths due to cholera in 1854. Adversity often brings opportunities, and thankfully, our people, having lived through the epidemic, recognize the importance of doing things differently to avert another outbreak. Studies were conducted, recommendations were made, and new pieces of legislation were introduced.
And we also have a report on conditions in Bridgetown, which was prepared by a civil engineer from Trinidad called Lewis Samuels. And he was commissioned after the epidemic to report on conditions in Bridgetown and recommend improvements. And so his report becomes a kind of a template for how to improve Bridgetown. And one of the things he includes in that report is the importance of having a clean water supply for Bridgetown. So, coming out of the epidemic, there are the first real efforts to try and clean up Bridgetown. And the first things they do are these. In March of 1856, there is a new Public Health Act which establishes permanent public health commissioners. This time they're not members of the Assembly, they're permanent officers. There's also a sanitary health inspectorate established, and the Public Health Board has much wider powers to inspect and to prosecute offenders and so forth. The second thing they do is they pass an act to demolish derelict and abandoned buildings because they're thought to be a site of infection. The third thing is that this is an interesting one, they ban the sale of fresh fish on the streets of Bridgetown because that was thought to be one of the causes of the infection. And instead they established a municipal fish market. This is in 1857. So the fish market in Bridgetown actually dates to this time and was a response to the cholera epidemic. Another measure was the appointment of a public works superintendent whose job it was to supervise any new building to try and make sure that it was built to a healthier plan. So all of those things are important, but the most important, in August of 1857, an act was passed to establish the Bridgetown Waterworks Company, which was a joint stock company, a private company, to provide piped water for Bridgetown. Now, amongst the original stockholders were several leading white citizens, but there were also at least two members of the coloured community. James Barclay and national hero Samuel Jackman Prescott was on one of the original shareholders of that project. Now, the Bridgetown Waterworks Company was commissioned to build a water supply for Bridgetown, and that water supply, piped water supply, eventually opened on March 31st, 1861. So that was the beginning of piped water anywhere in Barbados. Later on, the system was extended to the rest of the island.
So we had, as a result of the 1854 cholera epidemic, we had one of the earliest standpipe systems, so secure water systems installed across the island. So 400 standpipes were installed across the island to provide safe water to communities. And that was in 1861.
So when you look at what the aftermath of the cholera epidemic is, essentially it inaugurates an era of civic improvement in Bridgetown, upgrading of the city to try and make it a more healthful place to live. The lesson that you can learn from all of that is that it is very, very important to ensure that the basic amenities, the basic services and so on that go with a functioning society have to be maintained at a high level if you're not going to slip back into danger of these kinds of epidemic disease.
When you turn on your faucet today and let the water flow, you are in a sense honoring the visionaries who dedicated themselves to preventing another cholera outbreak in Barbados. Now, during the coronavirus pandemic, many stories emerged about its psychological impact. But have we considered the psychological effects of the cholera epidemic in Barbados?
For those persons who lived through cholera, it took another 70, 80 years for cholera and the disease to pass basically from memory, but not totally from memory, because persons who live near cholera grounds also have their stories about cholera.
Well, I think because of the erection of a number of public monuments within the years after the cholera epidemic in Barbados. So what we have, for example, is this idea that a number of years afterwards, the Dolphin Fountain in Bridgetown, the Montefiore Fountain, also in Bridgetown, were erected. It seems to me that the memory was not just erased from this kind of collective public recollection of those kinds of that particular event.
If you think about the disasters that you see on the news today, those kind of horrible events where thousands of people are being killed and all that kind of thing, whether it's earthquakes or wars or whatever. But very often it's the story of an individual, what happens to a particular child, how that war or how that disaster has affected that child, that really, really grabs you. And there are quite a few of those kind of stories, coming out of the cholera epidemic. But, when I think about the cholera epidemic as a whole, the thing that I find absolutely astounding is the scale of it, Can you really imagine a situation where a quarter of the people in your community die over the course of a few months? That's just, it's staggering, staggering. And the sense of horror and the sense of what had been lost must have been overpowering. You know, you talk a lot about the sort of physical effects of cholera and of the epidemic. You know, and you can put the statistics to all of that and so on. But the psychological effects of it must have been incredible.
And people still respect the cholera brown. There are some people who will still tell you, well, that is the cholera ground at St. George, and they're not going to dig there. They're not going to practice any agriculture there. No digging at all. So I think even though the disease is fading from memory, there's some elderly persons who still talk about it because it has been passed down to them through the oral tradition. And all across this country, you have cholera burial grounds. And one of the things that I think we ought to do as a government going forward is that we could have a little plaque on all of those burial grounds saying cholera victims were interred here in 1854. We have it for Bats Rock, but I think we ought to do it for St. George. We have to do it for Dover. We have to do it for lots of places to remember those persons who perish in that awful, dreaded cholera epidemic of 1854.
It is important that we educate the public about the many cholera burial grounds here in Barbados. While the coronavirus epidemic offered us an opportunity to learn many new things, we should also consider the lessons that were learned from the cholera epidemic.
As we commemorate the 170th anniversary of this cholera epidemic that killed 20,727 people in 3 months, I think there are some lessons that we can learn from this epidemic. And the first lesson has to do with the environment, keeping the environment clean, keeping the surroundings clean. Because the evidence suggests that in those places where there was a lot of congestion, a lot of filth on the streets, dilapidated houses, that cholera was really rampant in those places. Of course, it did not spare those individuals who were living in what we call high society. And it helps us to understand, therefore, that a good environment is one of the things that we ought to seek as we build this nation.
Things like poor toilet facilities or the absence of toilet facilities, the way persons dispense of their fecal matter, which ties into the need to really eradicate outdoor toilets, outhouses, and similar posal methods. So the quicker those impediments to good health are removed totally, the quicker we can almost rest assured that cholera, even if it arises again, will not spread as rapidly as it did in 1854. So any way that we can negate any instance of improper disposal of waste, or we can encourage access to clean water, will be a fillip towards preventing any recurrence of cholera.
But we should recognize that if we don't practice proper public health, if we don't practice proper hygiene, that is always possible for epidemics to reappear, because as the experts indicate, diseases, bacteria are always existing.
What lessons can Barbadians learn? I think that's an interesting question because of the nature of what cholera was and what it brought to the country. It is difficult to say that there are any lessons that could be learned. What happened there with people being kind and generous to each other and people looking out for each other? That is really one of the lessons that we could learn, because I find even when I was younger, I find people always looked out for each other. And Barbadian society was said to be friendly. People were kind, they cared for each other. These days, I am seeing as though that is becoming lost to us as a society. And that would be one great lesson, because through all the sufferings of cholera, there were many people who looked after people even at peril to themselves.
Well, I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the cholera epidemic in Barbados. One is that you have to continually invest in public health. It is not something that you can just say, you know, you have a healthy population today and let your policy, let your funding slide for the next decade or number of decades.
The problem with governments around the world are that they are afflicted with what you would call short-termism. They look at the immediate issues and they're much, much less effective dealing with long-term challenges. And as I say, with the issues like public health, with the threat of epidemic disease, those are long-term challenges which you have to have long-term plans for, and you have to invest in over time. And that's not so easy to do unless there's a political consensus to do it.
It requires constant vigilance and surveillance to ensure that people have access to those kind of primary care, sanitation, hygiene facilities.
Public health standards. For example, at public events, you know, you go to a fete, the food handlers need to be certified. All of these are important things. So it is about how you control human activity to ensure that you keep the possibility of diseases spreading to a minimum.
Public health is not something that is done necessarily in a hospital. It has to be done on the ground. It has to be done through safe and secure water systems, making sure that people have access to proper sewage. And if you don't have access to those things, then very quickly, as we saw, I think just before the pandemic, we saw how that lack of maintenance of our sewage systems, those that exist along the south coast and in Bridgetown, if those condition of those systems erodes, then we are also risking tourism, we're risking our own health, we're risking all of the things that become even more calamitous, especially like when we have hurricanes or storm events, because they lead to contamination or they're compromised. It can create even a bigger public health disaster, as we have seen in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. That was, you know, one of the first times in the 21st century where we started to really see this, again, cholera resurge in the region. I think we need to take away from the cholera epidemic in Barbados is that we cannot isolate ourselves from external shocks.
So we always need to be mindful of what can happen, what can be brought in. You know, one of the good things is knowing what quarantine is. You know, if you're able to prevent something from entering in the beginning, then you certainly prevent it from spreading. So if you have set up all the measures really to prevent infections from entering, or you're able to screen appropriately for possible infections and so forth, then you're able to prevent it from getting into your island. And I think having appropriate measures at the airports and the seaports will be good, actually a very good public health prevention measure to basically mitigate against these types of infections from entering. as I said, even if you have to think about COVID, it came in the same way. It came in through, from outside exposure, and you need to be able to set up all the necessary monitoring mechanisms, put all those in place, and of course to have adequate public health interventions even if it does breach the border, to have adequate public health measures in place, to have the adequate funding and everything sorted out, contingency funding to mitigate against these types of things, so you can kind of arrest it early. Because if you don't, then you can have things like this happening. And particularly if you don't understand the infection, if you don't understand how it's transmitted, if you don't understand, the way in which it's treated, the way in which it's diagnosed, if you don't understand any of those things, then you are at a real loss.
The most important lesson that I think Bajans should learn from the cholera epidemic is the importance of preparedness. Because you see that through the epidemic, before the epidemic came to the island, Bajans were well aware of it being in the region. In fact, we knew that it was in Jamaica as early as 1852, and despite this, we didn't make any approach to clean the areas in Brechon. And because we refused to clean the areas in Brechon, it led to the rapid spread of the epidemic. So I think that is a lesson that we need to learn to prepare ourselves for anything.
And we should have all the preparation with us, right? So we've been going through this for a number of centuries in Barbados, and in 1854 it showed up a lot of weaknesses in the public health system that needed to be immediately addressed after 1854.
And we must not say that cholera cannot return. We must not say that another disease cannot return, because we've just come out of 3 years or 2.5 years of COVID-19, where people were scared, people panicked, and of course people died. So the lesson for us, therefore, is as we build our nation, let us try to keep our nation clean. And it is an individual responsibility. I must keep my place clean. I must keep the surroundings clean. And if everybody does that, then we have a cleaner Barbados. Then we have a more picturesque Barbados. Then we will be able to stave off these diseases like cholera and live in a healthy and progressive society. And this series, I hope, will rekindle not necessarily fears of cholera, but commemorate that important period, that tragic period in our history.
And thanks to our historians and researchers, that tragic chapter in our history has been captured in the audiovisual format. It has been shared with you and is now preserved for posterity. This has been a special collaboration between the Department of History and Philosophy at the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies and the Archives and Information Department of the Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation. It involves historians conducting the research while my team and I prepared it for television. Thanks to all of you. This has been Mind Community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Be good to yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors.